cannabinoids. I'm going to be talking a little bit about considerations for blinding, drug preparation, and different routes of administration when doing human laboratory studies, which cannabis and cannabinoids do have. So just really briefly, some funding and disclosures. The other author of this talk is Tori Spindle. He's served as a consultant at Canopy, and most of our funding comes from NIDA, and I'm on the 232 currently. So just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to give a little bit of background on what human laboratory studies of cannabinoids are, how they're run, why we do them. Then I'm going to be talking about some considerations for routes of administration. So as we all know, cannabis is taken in many forms in many different ways. I'm going to be talking about the differences between studies that look at those different routes of administration. Talk a little bit about best practices for oral, vaped, and smoked cannabis studies, and then talk about a few additional considerations in terms of blinding and formulation. So why do we do human laboratory studies of cannabis and cannabinoids? Why are we still doing them, even with all the data we have now? There's a huge variety of cannabis-based products that are available, and more cannabis products become available pretty much every day. You can go out to any smoke shop in Toronto, anywhere in Canada, and even legal states in the United States, and you'll find just a plethora of these products with very different characteristics, and they tend to cause very different effects. So because we don't know exactly how these products are working and what the differences between them are, we need to continue studying them in the laboratory. So our human laboratory at Johns Hopkins, it looks, does studies that look at both biological samples. So some of these studies, we have people come in, we administer them cannabis. So as you can see here, we have a participant sitting with one of our research assistants. They come in, they're administered cannabis in some form. And then for many of our studies, we will measure THC metabolites in their blood, oral fluid, or urine, depending on what the nature of the study is. Most of the time, just general measures would all include subjective effects. So we're asking people about their subjective drug experiences, both positive, negative, and neutral. Questions like, how strong is your drug effect today? And so a lot of that is done on the laptop, as you can see here. The big thing that we're getting into now is also administering battery of cognitive performance tests. And this is important, obviously, because cannabis and cannabinoids impact many different domains of your cognitive attentive performance. As you can see, we have a full nursing staff, and we measure many vital signs, including heart rate, blood pressure, and others. And then for many of the studies where we do smoking behavior, we are also looking at puffing or puff topography. So the amount of drags, how deep the drag is, how long it is, how much smoke you're getting into your lungs. So a lot of the studies will also look at puff topography. So this is kind of just a general overview of the core measures of what we're looking at when we administer cannabis, cannabinoid, edibles, things like that. Some other methods and tests that we do in the laboratory have started to drift towards more targeted measures like simulated driving performance. So on the left there, you can see one of my PIs, Tori Spindle, in the driver's seat, and our driving simulator there. I don't think we have the fans there yet, but we have them installed through motion sickness problems. And then behind him, we have our RAs that are scoring their driving behavior. And then on the right, you can see, again, Austin and one of our RAs doing standardized field sobriety testing. This is another battery standardized tests that are used in the field by law enforcement, and we've started to fold into some of these cannabis studies. So some of the factors that are really important when doing cannabis research, and one of the things that we focused on in recent years, is differences between routes of administration. So when you're considering what route of administration you're going to study, what you're going to be looking at in your human laboratory study, there's many different considerations many different factors you have to take into consideration, specifically the difficulty of drug prep and dosing. So things like smoking a joint versus eating an edible versus vaping a certain amount of THC or cannabis. They all require different drug preparations, different work by your pharmacy, different blinding procedures. Time course is a big one that I'll be talking about today. When you're administering cannabis through a vape or a joint, through a pipe, it has a different time course of effects than certain edibles will be. And I'll talk a little bit about the newer oral formulations that are coming out now that we're studying that have different time courses themselves. And then another thing to consider is the strength of drug effects between these different routes of administration. And then additionally, I talked a little bit about this previously. I'll be talking about product formulation and some of the factors that you need to consider. So I just said new products are coming out every day. One of those is part of the drinks. These drinks with nanoemulsions have different effects and physical properties than your standard gummy, have different effects than your standard cannabis weed brownie, and so on. So you need to, when designing your studies, thinking about the physical properties of the drug that you're administering, what else is in it. So I know we've all heard about full spectrum, entourage effects, drug-drug interactions. That's a really big consideration for your human laboratory studies, because it can have a pretty significant effect on your outcomes, your subjective and cognitive outcomes. And then finally, sensory cues. So when you're administering drug, you have to think about if it's smoked, there's going to be taste, there's going to be smell, it's going to look like something. If you have ground up dry herb versus an oil versus any other formulation, you have to think about the sensory cues that are involved, and especially with cannabis, which is, as we all know, a very fragrant drug. So most commonly, obviously, cannabis is inhaled either through smoke, joints, pipes, things of that nature, or through vaporizers. Dry herb can be vaped, oils can be vaporized and consumed. And as we've seen now in recent years, the proliferation of these little vape cartridges has also been an area of concern we've looked at. So these are the most common routes of administration, or ROAs. I'm going to have that on these slides moving forward just to shorten things up a little bit. But this is what most commonly has been studied. We've recently been moving into doing a lot more studies with oral formulations. So as I said before, edibles, brownies, gummies, cookies, anything that I went to one of the stores in Montreal, and they had ramen that was infused with THC. So edibles can take many different forms. You have extracts in pharmaceuticals, things like Marinol. Sometimes we use that in our study because it's FDA approved and a different schedule than just regular cannabis. And then you can see drinks and nanoemulsions, other different types of drinkable cannabis have been coming on the market, and they have different effects as well. So I forgot to mention the topicals. So one thing that Tori Spindle has looked at recently are the effects of topical formulations of CBD, THC, things of that nature on subjective effects. And we're seeing a lot more of these topical formulations come out now with very little empirical study on them. So I mentioned before that when you're considering the route of administration for your studies, what you have to take into account is the time course of the case, right? So you bring a subject in, they are administered drug, they stick around to do subjective measures, cognitive measures, have blood draws. And if you're picking your route of administration, as you can see here on this slide, let's see if I can get the cursor out here. There we go. Yeah, well. On the left, we have 10 milligrams of THC that's been administered either through smoking, vaporizing, or oral administration. And what we have on the y-axis is their subjective drug effect, right? How strong is your drug effect today? And what you see with smoked and vaporized cannabis is that the drug effect is immediate and a lot stronger than what you see with oral cannabis, in both cases with 10 milligrams and 25 milligrams. And then on the right, what really you can see here is also how long it takes for the drug effect to onset. So if you're bringing a subject into your laboratory, you're administering cannabis, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking measures at the time of peak drug effect and not missing most of the drug effect because you took measures too early before the oral administration had onset. And then finally, also pharmacokinetics. So when you're choosing your route of administration, something that you want to consider is that if you're looking at blood levels of THC and its metabolites, the ratios of the THC, other cannabinoids to their metabolites may be very different depending on the route of administration. So you can't be comparing apples to oranges with smoked cannabis versus orally consumed cannabis. So just to summarize really quickly, the implications of route of administration, onset duration varies substantially among these routes of administration. You need to consider when you're starting these people. So let's say you're bringing someone in for an oral session. You can't be starting them unless you want to be in the lab very late. Don't start them at noon. We have people come in at 7:30 in the morning. If you're doing a smoke session, you can start a little bit later. That's just something to consider when designing the studies. Different products can produce substantially different effects due to numerous factors. I talked a little bit about the entourage effect. Something that I'll talk a little bit more is about fat content. And then pharmacokinetics. So you have to consider that biological specimens and analysis must account for differences in detection time. So oral might have a detection time that's much longer than smoked, and their metabolic rates, the ratios of those metabolites in their blood. So when you're putting together an oral study and you're choosing your oral study drug, you have to consider the fat content. So fat, we've seen in a lot of our studies, the higher the fat content in the edible. So let's say you have a brownie versus a gummy that has very little fat in it. The absorption of cannabinoids from the fattier matrix will be much greater than what we see with gummies or lower fat content or edibles. You also have to consider the, what's the word for it? How solid your matrix is. You know, the amount of dissolution and absorption you get from your drug and the speed at which that happens depends on the matrix. If it's, a drink versus a brownie, you're obviously going to get different absorption. And then I talked a little bit about this before, but when we do oral administration studies, we don't just give somebody a regular brownie. We tend to use placebo cannabis that has been denuded of all of its THC to provide those sensory cues without the drug. People are obviously very prone to placebo effects if you're not measuring brownie that has any sort of sensory cues in it, you can obviously lose your blinding. And then one thing that we've recently been having to standardize for is stomach contents. So if somebody comes in having eaten a very high-fat breakfast, they've had eggs, toast, and some sausage, they're going to have very different drug effects and very different blood levels of the cannabinoids than if they've had just a coffee and a cigarette that morning, okay? So what we've started to do and what the best practices are for oral studies is having them fast the morning before. Another reason it's good to have people come in at 7:30 in the morning, and then give them a standardized low-fat meal, which in our case has been toast and jam. When prepping drugs for, and specifically oral drugs for consumption or oral cannabis for consumption, when we use botanical cannabis, we grind it down into a fine powder. Something that has to be done with botanical cannabis that doesn't have to be done with different formulations is decarboxylating it. So you're going to be you need to heat the cannabis to make it active. We bake each individual brownie with the individually measured out doses to ensure dose accuracy. And then we instruct all of our participants to consume the brownie within 5 minutes. When doing inhaled administration studies, you have to also consider the vehicle in the matrix. When you're using botanical cannabis versus vaped cannabis, you might need different devices to do that. So right here, what we have is in many of our studies, we've used the Mighty Medic for ground up cannabis. If you're smoking cannabis, we use this pipe here with a fitted cap over it. And then obviously you have joints and handheld vapes as well. Many of these are used to control the sensory cues. So when vaped cannabis, you'll be able to cover up what kind of drug you're administering inside the capsule. With this pipe here, you're able to cover up the sensory cue of visually looking at the cannabis. The subject can't see what they're smoking. With joints, it's a little bit more difficult, but you also just use placebo cannabis. And then another thing to consider with smoked cannabis studies is that you have drug loss from side stream smoke going into the environment. I need to just keep moving here because I'm running short on time, but when doing vape studies here, I have a picture of our smoke box, the plexiglass box that we filled in one of our rooms to do all of these studies in. It's nicely filtered. You have to consider when doing these vape studies that you're using the right temperature that decarboxylates the cannabinoids and ensures complete vaporization. You don't want any of the drugs still left in your vaporizer. When we do vaporizer inhaled studies, we have people consume the drug ad libitum, but within a very set period of time, just so that we know when the drug was actually absorbed and fully administered. You don't want people taking 30 minutes and some people taking 5 minutes. It introduces variability in your study. And then blinding. With vaporized studies, it's very difficult. We did studies with THC and some of the terpenes, which are very aromatic. They're a strong sensory cue. And so in those studies, we blinded our participants to the visible vapor with something called a sploofie, which is here on the bottom, blow the smoke into it just to so that they don't see what they're exhaling or if they're not exhaling something. And then it also traps some of the smoke and aroma. With smoked cannabis studies, very similar best practices here. We have them consume the drug ad libitum, but within a very set period of time. Best results have been achieved for us with using a pipe versus a joint because of the side stream smoke loss. In the joint, you're losing all sorts of drug. You don't know how much is going into the environment versus their body. And then blinding, really, when you're using smoked cannabis studies, the only way to do this with placebo cannabis. I've already talked about formulation, I think, enough here. I won't get into this too much further, but full spectrum products, I think some of this bears repeating. Full spectrum products contain a lot of other phytochemicals and cannabinoids that may significantly impact your PK and PD outcomes. And then, especially when you're looking at formulation of inhaled cannabis products, you have to consider that plant material needs to be decarboxylated. And it's also full spectrum, depending on where you get it from. NIDA, they're smoking their own in front of their house. What have you, and then cannabis extracts may not require decarboxylation, or they might. You need to make sure that you're getting as much active drug as them, or you know how much active drug that you're getting when it comes to extracts. And then here's just some conclusions here. I talked about route of administration, non-THC constituents, and product formulation. They can all influence these effects of cannabis. You need to consider all of them when you're designing your studies. Major differences in time course and subjective effects are obviously exist between all of these different routes of administration. And as I've mentioned before, that inhaled cannabis needs more frequent measurements than oral cannabis. And then finally, blinding for all of these routes of administration require, either adding, so placebo cannabis, or mitigating some of these sensory cues that are from the drug. So if they're expecting cannabis, they should get some of those sensory cues. If they're not expecting some other sensory cue like terpene, then you need to make sure you're mitigating that. And finally, I'd just like to thank my lab, my PI towards Spindle, as well as where we got all of our drug for our studies, THC Farm and Cultivate Biologics. And I'd also like to thank our study participants who've made many of these studies possible. Thank you.